the pandemic really accelerating that, where you just don't have that in-person interaction as often. And so what's the easiest way for us to be able to get anything? It's through some type of self-serve online motion.
You've been at Wing VC, which is pretty heavily focused on PLG, right? It's kind of a sort of a core focus for the firm.
Yeah, so the firm has always been investors in enterprise B2B type of businesses and traditionally heavy in data AI and companies in that space that normally you would think about automatically would just be like, oh, this is sales-led type of motions in terms of reaching customers. But there's definitely been, I think they've been ahead of the curve for sure in terms of thinking about product-led companies also existing within enterprise and really disrupting a lot of the traditional ways of buying in the space. And so you're seeing a bunch more of that for sure within the Wing portfolio and from a pure focus of the firm.
Look at just a lot of companies kind of coming through. You've been evaluating. Have you seen more companies start as PLG than before, or are you seeing now more of this kind of founders are coming in thinking, hey, I'm going to be doing this hybrid approach? What has changed even in the last like 2 to 3 years? Like I feel like as a founder, just even getting started with Momentum, we certainly got a lot of questions at the beginning of what's the PLG motion? There's got to be a PLG motion. But then you get very divergent depending on kind of where maybe the investor comes from. It's very hard to do both from the beginning. You kind of have to pick. You have limited resources. There are different movements. So what have you kind of seen on the VC side as just founders have been coming up and starting their businesses?
Yeah, look, I mean, I haven't been on the VC side of the house quite as long, and so I can only give you the most recent experience, in which case, yeah, I would totally say you hear about PLG way more often. And that's just because, purely the trends of what is possible has totally changed, because now it's so easy to be able to facilitate the entire buying motion online with Shopify, Stripes of the world, all really kind of opening that up for anybody to be able to build any website now, and you can buy a product on there. And I think that's why you see a lot more investment of those types of companies, and also something that VCs, Wing or not, like really emphasizing that. And usually, there's a reason why for that. It's because you're able to facilitate faster deal velocity in terms of getting stuff closed. It's almost instantaneous, whereas before, right, like if you're thinking about talking to seller, there's a lot of back and forth. You got to go through a contract, think about the PO and the invoice, and that takes time. And so in this model now with PLG, where you can facilitate instantaneous buying, that should be a lot faster in terms of getting to monetization and putting up numbers on the board that, venture investors are looking for. You might actually be able to be honest, like give even more insight on that, just given that from a founder's perspective. It's actually really interesting to hear you speak to how over the last few years things have totally changed from when you first started, and then now people are also asking you to add on emotion that y'all hadn't originally considered.
Yeah, I think it was really kind of one of the first things we asked ourselves is which direction, kind of like bottoms up self-service or top down, because I think that you fundamentally put those building blocks for your company differently depending which one you're going to do, even when you're just three founders and you're doing all the sales or you're doing the product building. I think if you're doing PLG, you're thinking about the product experience from a different place than top down. I think you have a little bit more liberty to, well, maybe you're going to build a more complicated product, or you're like, well, we got a little more room to kind of, you need to build a beautiful product experience no matter what, ultimately. But I feel like from out the gates, if you're never going to engage with a salesperson, your product needs to speak for itself from the beginning. And that very different choices in terms of onboarding and the first kind of user experience when you sign up. And I think for something like Momentum, as much as we, we started Momentum summer 2020. So it's like PLG. Of course, we're like, we got to be PLG. But one of our quickest kind of limitations was just Slack admin rights, Salesforce admin rights. So I do think you have to be just like honest with your product and your audience, and to say that, you know, you got to keep both in mind. Maybe eventually you'll layer in the PLG motion, or you'll layer in the sales led, but out the gate, what's going to work for your business? PLG is not for everyone. I think that's kind of the takeaway I've had, is like,
yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with you about that. It may be the hot, cool thing to be focused on, but at the end of the day, it's really about whether or not you can generate the type of user flywheel that keeps them coming back, engaging in the product, and be able to do that just all in the product without needing someone to help facilitate that. And if what you're doing requires someone, whether it's a salesperson or a customer success person, to be able to bring them along the journey with you to help them understand the product, or it's just too technically complicated, it may not make sense for PLG to be the route to take early on initially. And there's different ways to think about that too, right? Like maybe PLG made sense today, which is at the beginning, which is all the companies I've worked at, they've taken that kind of track, but eventually at some point in time, they needed to move into different segments with customers that had completely different requirements. And that required sales teams to help them understand why they should purchase this particular version of the product. And same with, vice versa, taking that from some folks may have started off in a sales-led type of motion. And let's just say you're doing these large, massive straight out of the gate, like ELA type of deals that requires that. But maybe you're going down market instead, and these mid-market companies aren't ready for that type of, they just simply can't afford it, or, they're thinking about trialing the motion. It may not necessarily make sense for them, for you to engage and hire more sellers to engage with those types of customers. I'm just curious, like, if we can answer, there's a question from someone in the crowd that actually I think is quite relevant to our conversation right now. So the question for folks on the call is PLG a viable springboard for a land and expand model? And at what point in the process do you involve sales, or would you have CS take on that engagement? I would say, at least from my perspective, like PLG is absolutely a springboard into land and expand. The beauty of PLG a lot of the times, and the reason why people choose it, is because you can land with a very, very broad user base early on, and be able to reach a bunch of people before you could just do that with sellers in any capacity. So there's a land in the sense of someone is using your product. They may not necessarily be paying for your enterprise plan, or they may just be using your free plan, or they may be using a lower tier plan that you have up. But I would still consider that land in the sense of someone is using your product, so you've got your foot in the door from some level of trust and excitement about your product already. And so from there, it's a question of, are those the right people for you to be able to move them into a much higher tier plan for you? And are they also within a company or not? And there's a question there, I think, that goes back to the usual question around, do you have a salesperson engage versus customer success person, which it would be true in any type of sales model. And so kind of up to you all in terms of how each leader and each team and each company, what makes sense in terms of how they split up the duties of an AE versus a CSM.
Do you see any parallels to that, like at Canva in particular, InVision? Like when you were brought in, was it kind of around this? What was the driver for kind of layering sales led? You mentioned something about new verticals. Was it more land and expand? And what was the sentiment when it was, hey, we're going to bring in the sales led motion? Was there pushback? Was there concern that it would change the philosophy of the company, the culture of the company? What was your experience like there?
Yeah, let me speak to Canva just because it's the most recent experience for myself. And, the impetus for that was Canva wanted to launch a new product, their enterprise product. They were going up market and looking to target companies and teams and really focusing on, hey, how do we actually think about how people all collaborate together? And so Canva, most people initially started off coming to the product being like, hey, I need to create birthday cards for my kid's birthday party or for a barbecue or something like that. And so these things in your personal life, you go to Canva, and so people are already using that capacity. The beauty of Canva and what you can actually do visually there is you can honestly design for anything. And so I think it wasn't too far of a leap for us to think about, oh yeah, people are actually already using Canva too at work. So a good example of this is we would talk to individual sellers or marketers who, rather than use Google Slides, they were designing beautiful presentations inside of Canva already. And so it made sense to start to facilitate that type of option for Canva users. And so there were no salespeople, no customer success folks. The only customer facing team members already on the gang was the customer happiness team, which was our version of customer support. And so they were the ones that were also like fielding calls from people who are at companies being like, hey, like we've got 100, 500 people already like using Canva. We'd like to see if there's a higher tier plan that would make sense for us to pay for because people really love using your product already. So that's also a good example of that land and expand where, hey, you've already got a lot of momentum from this type of PLG type of motion where you can start working with pre-existing folks on the platform and upsell them essentially into these higher tier plans that you're ultimately offering. And from there, it's another kind of landing or jumping off point to other type of enterprise related questions, which for us selling into the CMO was the most obvious next step for us. And usually with brand teams and content teams who are constantly creating new visual publications, whether it was social media posts on Instagram and Facebook to, hey, we have this major initiative for the year, which is we're completely rebranding the business. And so we need to update every single asset that we have internally. How do we do that really quickly? And that was where the sales team could really come in and help with driving those conversations, because having a conversation with the CMO, that's a six-figure, almost seven-figure type of deal, is a very different conversation from being able to swipe your credit card if you're a content marketer one on the team.
What about what was it like kind of internally? How long did it take to hire the sales team, train them, bring them in, and then were you there when the two were sort of coexisting? Because I imagine it is a big shift if you've had, to have that level of growth at Canva with no salespeople, that's a shift.
Yeah, we move fast at Canva. Yeah. That is the one thing that
there's a reason they're valued at what they're
takeaway. Yeah. Yeah. It's honestly like mind-blowing how quickly the team there moves. And nice. I have a very similar mindset too in terms of moving fast. So we had our first AE who is actually based out in the US. We hired them first within, a month and a half of when I started. We also chose like the site of our US office within the first 6 months of being there too. We looked at multiple different spots as kind of like our go-to-market home base, but especially for customer-facing teams. And so that was down in Austin. We also were able to hire a leader to spearhead our customer and be our on-the-ground sales leader too. John, we got him in right before COVID hit too as well. And everybody shut down on the border. So it's a pretty nice. We walked the tightrope there and landed the plane on that front. And then we were also bringing on board very quickly our very first CSMs too as well out of the Sydney office. And so we had a few months of maybe not so fun coverage of different time zones out of Sydney, but we also had AEs on the ground. At the same time, look, we were launching a product. So we went into beta in August. We got a handful of completely brand new customers, some of the Fortune 500, and who weren't even on the Canva platform from a free user base perspective. And we also had folks in the beta who had various people across the organization in the tens or hundreds of people already on the platform in the beta. And so it's kind of a great mix for us of existing users as well as totally brand new customers for us to test out the initial enterprise piece. So it's just like a huge push for the full team on that front. But again, the speed thing is pretty incredible of the Canva gang, and I have to tip my hat off to all the help that I certainly had with everybody across the board, especially the folks down in Sydney, because accomplishing what they accomplished in that first year of getting the product out and then ultimately monetizing that very, very quickly is something that kudos to everybody who came on board. An absolutely massive effort.
Nice. What about the alternative? I feel like adding in the sales motion when you have a super successful self-service business, I'm imagining is slightly easier than adding in a PLG motion when you already have kind of a sales team and comp plans, and engineering building is certainly a product. But I think there's a need to bring in PLG on a sales-led motion to just also unlock growth. So what do you see as kind of on the other side, some of the challenges and some of the pitfalls?
Yeah, I mean, I think a key thing on this front is the two are the thing to remember is that they're not mutually exclusive. And to be honest, like I think, from my experience, at least working with most sellers and customer success folks, like they want to be working with some of the biggest accounts and biggest deployments across the board and thinking about how do they become better at their particular craft. And so you think about how everybody moves up segment by segment. There's different types of sales motions that you're facilitating, and PLG can coexist alongside them, or it can ultimately become the only channel where you target that particular segment. So there's different ways about thinking about it. In terms of bringing it in, you're probably actually trying to answer almost the exact same questions, and it's a matter of how you continue to communicate and motivate the team too as well. So example of this that you had mentioned already, it's like comp plans. So a big question early on was like, oh, why do sellers get commission off of these deals
Right.
that no one else was getting commission off of? And so that was question two, as well as, hey, like, how do we actually set appropriate quotas while at the same time we didn't really have any enablement or any of the things that you expect to really help the sales team be able to be successful in their conversations with prospects and customers. How do we kind of balance where we spend that time? And there were a lot of hard conversations. I'm not gonna, I won't sit here and pretend like it was all easy. It was easy at all, but even different things like tooling wise, for example, just having folks understand what tools were required to make a B2B enterprise type of sales successful were internal conversations that we needed to have with folks. When is the right time to move to Salesforce versus why couldn't we just use Google Sheets or something like that for everybody? What's the point of having a CRM? To even things like having a conversation around why does procurement and legal exist? Like, why can't we just go around them?
Right.
And so understanding, oh yeah, we need to get SOC 2 certified and go through all the usual security hoops. That was a big educational piece where once you brought in sellers, we could really have a lot of that conversation because we had these very real conversations with customers or potential prospects around just what is actually required for us to get in. And it's not just about having the best product or the easiest product to use or the most frictionless product. That kind of doesn't matter because there are certain things that we just can't get around with a purely product-led type of motion.
The sales side, as you're bringing in the kind of sales-led motion and you have a growing kind of healthy PLG business to sort of mine from, do you also need to kind of bring in that sort of outbound motion, or can you just rely on the customer base as like upsell and team selling, or do you need to bring in kind of the full scale traditional sales motion and say like, hey,
Yeah.
The PLG folks, like a lot of them probably want to stay not talking to sales for a reason. How did you guys think about that as you're building out the team and the motion at Canva?
Yeah, great question on this front, because this, I think, was one of the lessons that we learned very, very quickly at Dropbox, which was one of the earliest companies that really started to add on a sales motion to PLG. It's that even though the numbers look really big in terms of how many users you actually have, the reality is that you'll either go through those super, super fast, or just quite frankly, they're not the right people. And so more often than not, there's a reason why the early adopters of any tech startups product are usually going to be people who are fed up with pre-existing like tools inside of a business. And so they're starting to look for alternatives. Usually that's who the end user actually is, which means that they're more than likely not in positions where they have buying authority, where they can actually sign off and make decisions on company-wide tooling. And so even if they're really big champions of your product, or they may even be asked to actually evaluate like how good the product works, at the end of the day, you still have to convince, a VP plus level type of person to be able to sign off on using your particular product. And so you're going to have to start figuring out how do you get yourself in front of those particular buyers. And that means, having a sales team is really critical to making that possible. With respect to, hey, when's the right time to start really pouring on the gas on that front? This is where it's like a lot of experimentation, and having that move quickly mentality can be really helpful, because you want to be really flexible in terms of testing out multiple different hypotheses on what is the type of positioning and messaging that really works with the type of buyer that you're looking for. The good part is, in a PLG situation, you generally speaking can have some early like senses of who are the types of people that are more that would resonate with that type of message better, or they're willing to give you that answer already in terms of like how they thought about it internally. And so we had a lot of really great early customers at Canva who helped facilitate like, we can be your partner in helping with referrals with other customers, and or be your reference. We put a big emphasis on the customer success team and the AEs as well, in terms of trying to get logos, so that way we could start establishing the enterprise Fortune 500 type of credibility that we required. And kind of honestly, we were fighting against ourselves too as well, because everybody knew Canva, again, as personal usage perspective, no one had any idea we even had a product for enterprise businesses or teams. And so that was something where we were also, the customer facing teams were also mouthpieces for the company around, hey, we do have something that actually fits your particular set of needs. But this is where our early crew, one of the things that we really emphasized from like a hiring profile perspective, we were really looking for folks that understood that they needed to be super, super scrappy, and who wanted to just hustle and get in front of as many people as possible. And so, how that tied back into higher profiles, you're usually not going after folks with 25 years of experience selling into the Fortune 100. Those are folks that we knew for sure we weren't going to bring on board from the get-go, because they just simply, it's actually really difficult to get your Rolodex to look at new companies, and also no one's willing to write a multi-million-dollar check straight out of the gate for a brand new type of piece of software for them. And so we need to figure out which folks are really good at multi-threading across the organization, getting a lot of momentum going throughout different parts of the organization, so that way we can eventually, after a few years, be able to get to those bigger and bigger 7-figure deals that every customer facing team is looking for. Does that kind of answer your question? I know we actually hit upon
no,
quite a few different,
because I think that's,
we could go down a lot of threads.
I think you're just hitting on high level just how much kind of thought and attention needs to go into it, which I think is something that like I certainly experienced just even starting, at the beginning days of Momentum, of just like how quickly the questions would get thrown out of like, why aren't you PLG? Why aren't you? And you're like, these things really take a lot of strategy and thinking and the right team. And something I thought about as you were saying that is a company I worked for back in 2010, Sauce Labs. We started kind of top down, then we did freemium. Then that really did become a great engine for sales growth and ultimately kind of turned into an enterprise business again. But sales teams, it was kind of a double-edged sword of, man, we got so many people to pull from, but our pricing's on the website. So we're getting cannibalized by our self-service pricing. And I think that's one example of if you don't go into it with kind of the holistic picture of what this will do to the business in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, you'll set up your own traps.
Yeah.
What are some things around like pricing and just the sales model that you guys thought about or ran into?
Yeah, pricing is a really good, a really hot topic.
Yes,
Definitely
there's a whole
one we
business.
ran
Yeah, there's
into.
a whole
Yeah,
consultancies on
because
that for a reason.
totally. The thing with pricing is that you really want to be consistent when it comes to the philosophy that you're taking on that front. And this is a really good topic too, especially where you're very much a self-serve PLG based business, where that can run into a lot of friction when you start moving into the enterprise, because the actual sensitivity to price becomes a little bit different. So um, some really early ones that we ran into is from like a personal user perspective. Everybody was always, the feedback from users was always like, oh, pricing is too expensive, like we need you to keep dropping prices. And so that was a really helpful growth tactic for us on the product side of the house on self-serve, where we could actually we could make a lot more by dropping prices, because we would get so many more people subscribing to the product and converting them, that ultimately it was a no-brainer decision on self-serve. The challenge is that when you start selling into the enterprise, you can't just keep dropping prices, because at some point in time, the perception flips, and folks believe that something that's too cheap actually can't do all the things that you proclaim you can do and actually meet all the different enterprise requirements. And so it's kind of like a funky reverse psychology that you have on that front. Separately too is as you think about discounting too for the sales team, and like what tools do they need to have to be successful in that negotiation process with customers, you want to make sure you also have enough kind of a buffer in between your different plans, as well as like a clear understanding of what is the difference in value that you're offering across different plans. And so that was also a big debate for us internally at Canva, because we were trying to figure out, hey, what should we put into this enterprise teams plan that we also ultimately over time in the long run, we want to give away as much as possible to our pro tier and our free users too as well, because we believed in our overall mission at the end of the day, which is still the same thing that the sales team was gunning towards, was that we wanted to make it as easy as possible for anybody in the role to be able to design. And so having to keep that in the back of our mind while also trying to monetize and move into a different segment was definitely something that led to a lot of internal conversations.
We have a good question kind of related a bit to this as we think about kind of AEs. And so any lessons learned on involving AEs too early or too late in the process?
Yeah, I mean, the being really clear around what you want AEs to be doing, what you want your reps to be doing, and how they get engaged in the customer process is almost the same if you want to apply the same thinking to how do you actually build out the product. Like, what are the different touch points where you have a rep coming in versus when you just want people to be going through the product flows, things like that. And so that's something where being really crystal clear on that were early action items that we just need to take in terms of, hey, companies that were smaller than 50 employees, for example, it's just leave that to the self-serve engine and let them do their thing, because it just wasn't worth the actual uplift on having salesperson insert themselves in the process, because you're still only going to be able to close a 5-seat deal anyways. And so it doesn't make sense to have a rep on it where you'd be paying commission, whereas obviously with your self-serve, there's not that additional cost. Separately too, it's like a question around how quickly can you really push velocity. So Dropbox was a situation where our online sales team, and so these are sellers that are purely picking up the phone for like an inbound type of request. Everybody could close, 2 to 3 deals per day at kind of like the peak of the online sales team's efficiency, which is pretty crazy. Like it was a point in time where we were like, yeah, everybody's like, we can't even make a follow-up call because
like, make it rain. It's raining. It's
yeah,
like,
because
the dream.
Gonna close it. Yeah,
Right.
great, great situation there. And so that was something too, where it's like, okay, like very clearly we got to figure out if we want to go back to folks who require a little bit more, require more time to be able to buy. What is it exactly to move them to either a different type of AE, or do we need to be facilitating some other motion on the customer success side of the house, because they're probably a customer in some other capacity already. And so those are a lot of questions too, like when's the right time to start moving those lines around where you have different types of channels of engagement, from self-serve to online sellers versus pure direct sellers to channel and partnerships.
Got it. What about like when does it make sense to kind of complement now let me ask this one next, actually. Some tips for becoming more product led if you're sales led. Because I think it's a little bit easier to be, if you have so much growth, you're like, okay, we could start to bring in a sales team and accelerate. But on the flip side, if you're sales led, maybe you don't have super fast growth, but you have kind of a healthy business. Could PLG sort of unlock things further? And are there any signals that you could be looking out for?
Yeah, the same type of mindset around, I think, experimentation is really key here, and you want to take bite-sized chunks off too as well, to make the PLG motion successful, while not necessarily slowing anything down or cannibalizing anything from what's already working on the sales side of the house. And so this is a similar type of question where, hey, being really obvious about why you're doing PLG, and usually companies that have been sales led and want to bring a product led motion is because they've realized there's some level of engagement in the product that they can actually automate, but that doesn't actually affect the end user from continuing to fully finish whatever actions they have to take that really predict continuous usage or engagement, depending on your model. Like ultimately what drives you being able to constantly close deals or continue to retain and expand those customers. And so again, a lot of times that means let's just say onboarding, for example, because that was something too that probably has come up for you at Momentum. Having that type of, there's a lot of like proven motions around, hey, these are the marketing activities that you do to drive people to your website and to your product, and into signing up. But from sign up, once you go through that flow, a lot of times you just get thrown into a product, which can be really, really overwhelming. And so some of the best practices from a product-led company is you are very, very directional or intentional around what you want people to see from the get-go. So that way, within 30 seconds to up to maybe 2 minutes max, because that's the amount of attention span and patience that people will actually have for playing around in your product. You have them look and try out and test out the things that you really want them to be using, and ultimately what they're willing to actually pay for. And so you can use a lot of the feedback that you already have from your pre-existing customer base that your sellers have engaged in to help be able to inform how do we make that part of the process a lot easier. And so you don't have your customer success folks spending all this time on onboarding calls, where you have a massive Zoom call with like 100 people at a time, trying to get them to go through that login flow, and then ultimately, like, how do you actually set up your account in there? And so you can give back your team a bunch of that time, and also have, your customer success folks really focus on what is specific to that company in terms of why they're using your product, and what gets them excited about it, as opposed to making sure that you're stepping alongside every single user on the platform and making sure that they actually finish the onboarding flow.
One thing that this is making me think about is just the time aspect on both sides too. It will take time to add a sales-led motion and prove that out. It will also take time to build out a PLG motion once you have already have an enterprise
Yes.
business, and you might have hundreds of employees and you have a full sales team.
Yes.
And any sort of ways to sort of measure if it's working or not, and how long you should experiment versus not? Is it a year, 2 years, 3 months? It's like, I can imagine that, especially at scale. Let's say you're making 50 million ARR doing sales led, but you think that PLG could unlock further growth. That will not happen overnight.
Yeah.
Any experience you've seen, or companies that you've looked at or talked to that have kind of gone through this and navigated it successfully?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Like, expectation wise, there needs to be some level of commitment one way or the other. It kind of doesn't necessarily back into a very crystal clear cut rule in terms of how much time it actually takes. But either way, you're investing in something that's going to cost you dollars. If you're adding on PLG, that means you're going to have to hire new engineers, you're going to have to hire product designers, folks that know how to build into your existing product the way it's structured, and then bring alive this new experience that may not have existed before. And so the types of metrics that you're looking for in this case is going to be around user growth and user engagement, that may not necessarily even fully translate into monetization in the beginning. And so you have to be very patient that, hey, you're probably not going to necessarily explicitly make dollars from the get-go. On the other hand, if you're thinking about bringing on a sales-led team, then you can put in place general expectations around, hey, like, based off of how much a rep costs, fully loaded, you can apply a lot of the same principles for what you would have for a regular sales team around what type of quota do they need to be hitting, how quickly can they actually ramp up to that level of efficiency that you would expect, cost envelope wise, and continue to get to best in class when you think about payback periods and stuff like that. And so you're using a lot of very similar metrics, which is nice, but also just, a lot of these like PLG companies, for example, like they weren't making money for many years before they even made their first dollar on self-serve. And so that's the mindset too that you have to remember. You have to remember a lot of these companies also started off hitting different types of metrics from maybe what you are used to today based off of where you started from.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's kind of easy to judge them or compare the later stage once they figured it all out without those beginning days. We've got a question. How do you think about the trade-off between land and expand strategy, which would mean probably lower prices in most cases, versus anchoring at a low price and not having price increasing power over the long term? I think that what that's kind of saying is landing and expanding and kind of playing around with price being a lever down the road versus just getting in at the low price.
Yeah, I mean, pricing always changes. That is one of the definitely true things that takes place, and no matter what company, at least that I've ever worked at or seen, prices are constantly changing, and people are experimenting different ways. And this is probably more obvious in PLG businesses, just because you have a lot more areas where you can segment out experiments. And so really easy example of this is pricing in the US versus, say, pricing in Indonesia. And so we would charge a very different, much more localized pricing there versus in the US, just purely because there's no, folks just cannot afford the same type of price levels as American customers. And so things like that, you'll see probably a bit more experimentation at different PLG type of companies. Now, what that means from a sales perspective around where you want to anchor, I think kind of depends on your segment that you really want to focus on in terms of acquiring. And so that's where, like at Canva, we had a lot of debates around this because most of our existing customer base were single player folks, essentially, like just me and Ashley on our own using Canva and paying for it on a monthly basis. That was at some points in time, less than $10 a month type of situation where you could definitely pay for that out of our own pockets and have loads and loads of value out of that. And you can use it personally, you could also use it at work. But when you think about for a business, at some point in time, $10, if you're charging $10 a month versus $8 a month, it's kind of, there was no difference. In fact, we had customers being like, you should probably charge higher. This is a little low. And so, which is like kind of a totally different, not what we were expecting type of situation. But, we also didn't want to make it too big of a jump from where things look like. And so this is something where when we launched the product, we were like internally, let's agree to having the initial pricing and reevaluate this 6 to 9 months down the road and just see how that's affecting all of our different customer segments. And we had landed at $30 a month per seat on the enterprise plan because that was where a lot of competitors were also pricing things. And so we wanted to see and just hear the reaction from prospects around like, does that make sense or not? Were we going to have to discount quite heavily when we were actually going through the procurement process? And ultimately, again, also very different views in terms of what we were cool with 6 to 9 months down the road, but we would constantly have this iteration process to figure out what made the most sense. But we even had, COVID also like came in the middle of it, which was kind of an interesting situation because COVID really drove a lot of self-serve usage upwards because everybody now had to do things remotely and online. There were way more people willing to pay for like the pro plan. But on enterprise, you're coming into a situation where similar to now today in the markets, where a lot of companies are looking to cost cut and make sure they were batting down the hatches for a recession. And so for them, Canva wasn't necessarily a locked and loaded product into the day-to-day yet of the entire company. And so it's one of the obvious like first things where if you're a budget owner, you're like, oh, maybe I can like cut this so that way I don't have to let someone go on the team or something like that. Those are like the trade-offs that we had to be really mindful about. And so for us, we had to get comfortable with different things like, hey, like, why don't we actually give you X number of months free? Because we're lucky as a company at Canva that we can absorb that cost or those 3 months, make sure we still hang on to the customer, make sure that they're still super engaged in the product. So once we ride through some of this uncertainty in the market, we have earned a lot of goodwill and credibility and have also bought us enough time to prove out the value of the product for these more senior decision makers who may not have necessarily seen Canva in play and don't understand yet how it could actually help out their team overall from an efficiency perspective, from a budget perspective. And so those are a lot of things that we're thinking about. Now, kind of coming back to, I know I went off a little bit on a tangent again, coming back to the original question.
It was a good tangent.
This is where, this is where I think, the anchoring at a lower price, they both give you optionality. It's usually harder to increase price than it is to anchor higher and then come down. And so a lot of times if you're just experimenting for the first time, like the tack that most people take is, hey, let's start at a higher price because it's always, people are going to love it when you bring down the price.
Right.
They're less excited when you move up. But at some point in time, too, if you take the lower price, you'll eventually have to increase prices or think about coming out with a new SKU where you can charge a higher price, because it's just a numbers game. At the end of the day, there's only X number of people that are actually willing to buy at that price point, and you'll either run out of them, or your competitors are going to pull them out from uh, pull them away from you. And so you got to think about, hey, how do you constantly open up and phase in new revenue channels for the business to continue growing at the rate that you need to grow as a company.
Nice. I want to open it up because I know we have 10 more minutes. Are there any other questions from the audience? Anything that, thank you so far for the questions that we've gotten. I'll give it just a moment to see if anything else comes in. Well, as we're waiting, any other wrap up things just that we've kind of the takeaway stuff that we maybe didn't cover in our chat, or just as you're thinking, advice for companies that are kind of on either stage thinking about it? I think this audience is a lot of, reps and rev ops. And so maybe anything for them to keep in mind as their companies are going in one direction versus the other.
Yeah, I mean, you'll matter no matter what direction the company is going in. Like there is so much to be gained from both types of approaches, and reps, rev ops, everybody fits in, product folks all fit into that equation. And it's a matter of how do you kind of like reposition yourself or adjust to that type of model at the company, especially if you really want to work at that company. And so you're probably going to be focused on slightly different things, whether it's building a new sales deck or building a sales deck that never existed. If you're at a PLG, adding on a sales-led motion, or from a sales-led motion to a product-led motion, thinking about, oh yeah, which one of your customers would really love this totally automated sequence? Like, how do I get them on that so I can actually focus on another one of my customers who's really struggling and not sure if they actually see value from the product? It's all about how you spend your time on what ultimately can help you either get to your number or help the full company, get to their number. And so there's always a way to kind of figure out how do you actually get there, and do it alongside everybody else in the business. And so yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of stuff out there in the ether with respect to, hey, you have to do one or the other, but I think they definitely can coexist. And it's very possible to be super successful, and you can go with either direction from the get-go. It's ultimately what makes the most sense for your customers that you're targeting.
We've got a question that just came in that I appreciate. It's should PLG be for a totally different user experience or a totally different user, or both? I think
yeah.
Does that make sense? I think it's a good one to, as you're thinking about how do we apply PLG to what part of our business to who? Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe both.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, PLG probably works on folks who are end users, or if you have some type of overlap in terms of end user with the buyer, that is a super ideal situation, because you don't need to think about multiple people involved in that process of getting them to buy. And because a lot of the times there's just different preferences on like what people actually care about priority wise. The user experience in PLG has to be really, really good. And so the more complicated your product is, or the more technical usually, the less likely that you see some PLG stuff. You'll see fewer of them. There's still companies that can do this really well. So Cloudflare, for example, which isn't necessarily the first type of company that you think of today that is PLG, but they actually, like from the get-go, gained a ton of traction, especially in the broader developer community early on because they were pioneering a new part of the internet and really needed to get that level of buy-in and people trying and switching their websites to this new type of software that they offered. But eventually, they had to move over to um, an enterprise type of model because they were able to charge, 60K CV at that point in time as like the starting point for people purchasing Cloudflare. And as they started to add more functionality and become a bigger and bigger kind of gatekeeper, they're able to actually do that on the web. But then it's like you are ultimately thinking about different types of people in the process. You're not just thinking about the engineer who flips the on and off switch on whether or not the website is live or not. You're now also thinking about the CIO who's going to be like, oh, do I really want to buy Cloudflare? Do I want to keep stay on Akamai? What are the things for why I would rip out a solution that already works really, really well? That may have nothing to do with the with the end user experience on that front. Yeah, but I think rule of thumb wise, what's easiest is PLG is something where the end user and the buyer are probably the same person, and they expect as little engagement with any person in order to accomplish what they're trying to get done. And then sales is for a much more complicated product that requires explanation and walking through and a person to really help guide you in that experience.
Great summary to wrap it up. I think I want to give everyone 3 minutes probably before their next Zoom call. So thanks so much, Tiffany. Really appreciate you taking the time and chatting. And thank you, RevGenius, for hosting this with us. And thanks everyone who joined. All your questions were awesome. And we'll be sharing the recording, so it'll be available and sent out to you. But thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you,
All right,
everybody who joined.
Bye.
See y'all.